hit the button, and we are now live streaming on YouTube. Um, I'm going to start out by giving a quick introduction. I want to say hello to everyone who's tuning in um, now or in the future. My name is William Plotnick, and I'm the executive director of Sini Limici. We're a nonprofit organization based in New York City, dedicated to exhibiting, distributing, promoting education around, and more recently, restoring Brazilian films. I want to thank everyone for tuning into tonight's event, Redenção in Focus, a conversation with João Luiz Vieira. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing program, Você Acredita em Cinema na Bahia? Cinema of Salvador between 1953 and 1961. Our program, which is the first international collaboration between the State Film Archive of Bahia and North American organizations, is dedicated to showcasing the richness of Bahian cinema during one of its most effervescent periods. We are currently exhibiting 6 Bahian films, among which Redenção, the 1959 film by Roberto Pires, is included. And I really want to recommend people to check out that program while it remains online until the 15th of July. To begin tonight's event, I really want to thank everyone that helped make it possible. I want to thank Petrus Pires, the son of Roberto Pires, and Johnny Begood for allowing Sini Limici to exhibit the work of Roberto Pires on our website and in New York City theaters over the past months. I want to thank our program partners, the Cinemateca da Bahia and Spectacle Theater. And I want to thank the multiple governmental institutions in Bahia for their various means of support throughout the course of this program. Last but not least, I want to thank João Luiz Vieira for being here tonight. João Luiz Vieira is a professor in the Department of Cinema and Video and in the PPG Cine postgraduate program in Cinema and Audiovisual Studies at Universidade Federal Fluminense. He holds a PhD in Cinema Studies from New York University and a postdoctoral degree in Film and Television Studies from the University of Warwick. In 1996, he was a Fulbright visiting scholar in the Department of Arts and Media at the University of New Mexico, and in 2002 in the Department of Film and Comparative Literature at the University of Iowa. Author and editor of several works, including Cinema Novo and Beyond, Câmara Fácil ao Cinema de Sergio Bianchi, book chapters in World Cinema's Transnational Perspectives, Nova História do Cinema Brasileiro. João recently co-edited with B. Ruby Rich a dossier on contemporary Brazilian cinema for the journal Film Quarterly. This year, he published a chapter on intermediate convergences in Chanchada in the recently released book Towards an Intermedial History of Brazilian Cinema, organized by Luciana Najib, Luciana Araujo, and Thiago de Luca. And for a long time at Sini Limici, we've been eager to find a means of collaborating with João in some fashion. So tonight, it's very special to have you with us here for this conversation. And I really thank you for joining us. It really adds a lot to dialogue around Redenção. And Redenção indeed is the film we're here to talk about by Roberto Pires. It's a work that represents the first feature-length film made in Bahia, the first ever anamorphic scope film produced in Brazil, and one of the earliest and most interesting forays into the crime cinema genre in the country. In its own right, Redenção is a very interesting film, but there's really no talking about it without also having a discussion about what's going on in Brazil, about what's going on in Brazilian cinema at that time in general, what's occurring in Bahian cinema and culture, and about Roberto Pires on a larger level. So tonight, I hope that we can touch on all these aspects in some form or another, and perhaps expand into categories that we did not expect. So before I lay out some questions for us to get into, João, I understand you want to say a few quick words to introduce the discussion and Redenção. So I'll pass the mic to you, and please.
Okay, William, thanks very much. And it's really a pleasure to be collaborating with Sini Limici, and especially with you. And I always remember, like years ago, our first meeting at Delhi in Ipanema when you were coming from the US full of ideas about Cine Limite. Not the name Cine Limite didn't exist at the time. He
No.
was really worried about watching Brazilian films in the US and outside the US also, films that would be out of the canon of Cinema Novo, out of the courses of the traditional courses of Brazilian cinema in the US, and that you were very impacted with the work of Richard Penha, our common friend at Columbia University, who showed some films outside of that canon, but
Hmm.
who usually talk about other films that were important, but that were unavailable for audiences in the US, especially students to watch. So I remember that vivid conversation over lunch in Ipanema, and then we haven't been, I mean, we have been in touch all this time, not as often as I would like to, but I have been following the work of Cine Limite uh, every time I have some time. It's really nice, the page. It's really wonderful the way that you are really dedicating yourself to this project. And I think all of us have to thank you for your initiative, your competence, your care, and your responsibility of bringing this not only to us, because now we are on this internet world, so it's not only us, it's actually something that goes beyond the us. So thanks again for inviting me, and let's talk about uh, Redenção. What I was, first of all, before we begin talking about, like, how do we look at Redenção now in 2022? Of course, there is always this historical aspect of looking backwards and understanding the context that produced the film like Redenção. But looking at the film from our perspective today, it always, because what we are seeing a restored print, but from a 16 millimeter print, not a 35. And from what we see, I mean, there is something that always makes us wonder if we are real. What are we watching? Are we really watching something that the public in Bahia, at the opening of the film in Cine Guarani, which was 1959, were they seeing the same thing that we are seeing now, many years later, you know? And what strikes me about Redenção now is that it looks like something very experimental. When we look at that photography, which maybe it's, first of all, it's black and white.
Hmm.
Uh, in CinemaScope. That's unusual. That's completely unusual. When we read about, for example, the technical details and the tenets that 20th Century Fox put when releasing films like The Robe or How to Marry a Millionaire at the beginning. This is 1953, September 1953. When we see what they were thinking about, what could CinemaScope be? It's always color, huge spectacles, uh,
Hmm.
extremely expensive films. That was the pattern for CinemaScope. Then we have here in Brazil, you have at the beginning, I would say, almost like sounding the trumpets for Cinema Novo, which was right at the beginning, which was coming, which was, uh, we see, well, what we see now, a 16 print of a CinemaScope film, which is not the best quality ever. We see something which is black and white, which is totally different from a huge spectacle, sets, huge lavish sets, hundreds of actors and guests and guest actors and whatever. So it's that's how I think we should look at the film now and also at that time, because those very luxurious CinemaScope films, and then all the other technical conquests of the 50s, like Cinerama, then VistaVision, Technirama, then Todd AO, and then 70 millimeter, all that. I mean, they really meant something very special, very special. And I think that Redenção is something that goes beyond that concept. And I think that's, I mean, we can look at the film and look at the narrative, and as you say, and as I have read somewhere else, it's almost like a Brazilian film noir at that time. It is a Brazilian film noir in many aspects, but it's more than that as well. So the experimental side of Redenção, I think there is a distance, William, between the narrative, the plot, the story, which can be very simple. And I think that's not the importance of the film. The importance, I think, it's in its use, in its experiment with widescreen, in its courage to make something that went against the tenet of a big studio like 20th Century Fox. And I think that relates to Cinema Novo. That
Mm.
experimental impulse, I think, is related to the time of the late 50s in Brazil, not only in Bahia, but also here in Rio and Sao Paulo and other places. I mean, this is just to begin the conversation.
Yeah, I wanted to stick to that point of scope here because it's interesting when Richard Pena, when he came to speak at one of our screenings here in New York City, of Tokai no Asfalto, he gave a framework where he was talking about this was a period when Brazilian cinema didn't know what it wanted to be, and Roberto Pires is making a suggestion that Brazilian cinema can be technically proficient. It can be influenced by American cinema, by a kind of beautiful cinema, kind of perfect style of filmmaking that indeed, according to Richard at least, would not win out among the many filmmakers over the following decade. And I mean, you just brought up the picture for us of Roberto Pires, and he apparently, so he's sitting there and he's watching O Manto Sagrado, the robe, for the first time, and at the 1953 film that's playing in Brazil. And what you're saying is very true, that these scope films were meant to portray this grandiose mise en scène, all the details of like a grand opera within the frame of a film. And I'm wondering, of course, it's almost impossible to speculate, but what do you think Pires sitting there at that period? Why do you think it inspires him so much? This format, and of course, he goes on to make a film noir in scope.
Right.
Which
Right.
how many film noirs are there in scope? Probably.
Very few.
I
Very,
can't think of any. I
yeah.
can't think of any besides this film. So, what do you think spoke to a young aspiring filmmaker in 1953 about
Right.
such a format, and especially considering what's going on in Brazilian cinema at the time and what is available technically? Why do you think
Right.
that inspired him so much to go to this incredible length? I mean, he goes home and he invents his own lens to do it. So if you had to speculate, what do you think spoke to the young Bahian filmmaker in that period and
Right.
drove him to do this, and then to make a film that has nothing to do with the type of films that
Right.
were being made?
Right. Yeah, well, first of all, William, I think that very few countries had made that kind of experiment connected with 20th Century Fox. We find black and white films made in scope in Japan, for example,
Hmm.
black and white criminal films in that period, in the late 50s. So, but that's very rare. And we have Redenção here. Well, I mean, this is between brackets. Perhaps someone has to plan a CinemaScope series somewhere, with some CinemaScope films from the canon, and also the alternative, the more independent, let's even say non-industrial, this concept of a non-industrial cinema, a cinema we can talk about all time avant-garde, we can talk about underground, we can talk about independent, whatever those names. So there is that impulse was here to start with. But the other thing is that if we look at the exhibition at that time in the late 50s here in Brazil, we will see that in Rio, at the time when Redenção was made, even before, I'm talking about 55, the road opened in Sao Paulo and Rio in 1954. By 1956, when Roberto Pires began concocting the idea of Redenção, of making the first Bahian feature film, we had already in Rio, in terms of exhibition, we had a circuit, a chain of 17 theaters. In São Paulo, we had twice as much. In São Paulo, we had, by 1956, we had around 30 theaters that were converted to the widescreen and converted to CinemaScope. So that in Bahia, you had already a few theaters, not that many, but o Guarani was the one that opened. That was the shop window theater. I'm using Ross Melnick's. I don't know if you have seen Ross Melnick's last book. I have it. I have it right here at my table. Just a moment.
Okay.
This is very informal, so it's a great book. It's called Hollywood's Embassies: How Movie Theaters Projected American Power Around the World. It's a great book. Like this, it's a very nice cover, and he has one whole chapter on Latin America.
Oh wow.
Yeah, a whole very well researched, very well written, but very well researched. So we had the movie chain, the exhibition chain in Rio, in São Paulo, in Salvador. The main cities had state capitals had at least 1 to 3 movie theaters that were converted to CinemaScope. But Rio and São Paulo, of course, had the most. So that was in the producer's mind. There was that was the future, that was coming. So that's one aspect. And then we have to think about Roberto Pires' personality as an inventor. We talk about inventiveness. We were just mentioning inventiveness when we were just preparing here for this talk. And then you had that. You had, together with him, we had another man that was a cameraman called Oscar Santana, also a producer,
Right.
cameraman. He would write screenplays as well. So we had the combination of those two men were vital for, first of all, to really have the consciousness of making cinema in Bahia, which would answer the question to your series here, which would be yes, there was the impulse, there was the will. We have to have cinema in Bahia. What do we need? We need cameras, we need equipment, we need people, but especially technical means to do it, which were unavailable because everything was very expensive. And then I think that comes this idea. Well, the story of making this Brazilian film in widescreen, I think for us, it's well known because they spent, the film was made between, let's say, 1956 and 1958. It took about 2 years to do the research itself on the lenses, on the anamorphic lenses to make this film in widescreen took 8 months.
Yeah.
This is all very well detailed in a text written by Oscar Santana, who I'm going to send it to you. I told I'm going to send it to you in Portuguese. It's very interesting to read. Make us think about always this idea of if you don't have the right means, you have to create the means, but you have to do it. You have to be resilient. You have to be persistent. You have to resist and do things. And they were the ones, we have this expression, pôr a mão na massa, put your hands in the pasta. It would be like this, which means you have to do it. You really have to get your hands and do it.
Mhm.
So you have the combination of those two profiles, of those two individuals, both of them really keen on what they were wanted to do, really focused is a good word because of the optics. It's good. So what we have here, the story that goes is that they had Roberto Pires' father was an optician and had an optician store called Mozart, the musician's name, in Bahia. And I mean, they wanted to make the first Bahian feature film. And they were looking at this exhibition side, the future of cinema being invested into widescreen, in the wide aspect ratio screens. So they said, we have to begin at the top. We cannot begin with something that's been. How do you begin something that the future is telling you that it's going to be this way? So that's what made them do the research and write the screenplay. But especially, they were mostly connect at the beginning, connected not with the story, but with how to do the widescreen film here. And I think you might know the story that after doing a lot of research, they got see this is also 1954 in Salvador, 2 years before they started making the film. uh, they had a friend. I mean, this is all very. They had a friend at the projectionist of the robe. Do you know this story, William?
Y-
They took five
Yes, but
scenes.
go ahead and give it again, please.
The guy, it's amazing because the guy gave them, smuggled, let's say, 5 frames from the print of the robe so that they could study. They could look and see the compressed image, the anamorphic, and start researching and doing the optics, which which the lenses that they were researching, they could work and they could find at Roberto Pires' father's store, Mozart. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is the screen. They had they had constructed a huge horizontal screen to do the tests at the auditorium of the Association of the Employees of the Commerce in Bahia, which was a very nice place in Salvador. They had put the screen there and they were doing that. They were doing until they found a way. They said, well, we've made it. That's one story. That's one thing. The second thing that I would talk about is the name, which is very, I think it's a great story. This is Oscar Santana's statement on Igloscope, in which he says that he lived, I think, in Graça, the name of the neighborhood in Salvador. No, Oscar lived in Roma neighborhood in Salvador, and Roberto Pires lived in Graça.
Mhm.
So the place where they would meet to discuss things were some Praça da Sé. At Praça da Sé, there was a bar, a cafeteria bar, called Igloo. The name is Igloo. Do you
Yeah.
know why?
No,
Because
well, because it's so hot in Bahia.
now there was a painting of an igloo, a painting of an igloo with
Ah,
Eskimos in
the myth
Bahia.
is always that because
With
it's
Eskimos.
supposed to be ironic because it's so.
It's amazing when we think about Eskimos in Bahia, which is very hard. It's totally absurd.
Yeah.
But one question: the place doesn't exist anymore. But one thing that I would love to see is that whether they were tiles, because there is this tradition in Rio bars of having very interesting. Some of them are already considered landmarks, some of those huge paintings in
Mhm.
tiles, or if it was a mural. Perhaps it was, I don't know if there were tiles or murals. I have to check that. But in any case, that was the igloo, the Eskimos, and the owner of the bar. They would come, they would work until late at night, and sometimes about at 2, this is Oscar Santana talking. At 2 in the morning, they would be hungry, and the only place that was open at that time at Praça da Sé was the Igloo bar.
And there
So
you
they
go.
would meet there, and the guy, the owner of the bar, was very. He also was someone, those people that
Is
really
that the
like.
bar? Is that the bar featured in the film? Even
Yeah, yeah.
because
Or maybe,
in the
maybe the
film,
bar in the film.
yeah.
Maybe. Hmm. Perhaps I don't know about that setting of the bar. It might be. That's an interesting question. There is a lot to do about Redenção. Still, there is a lot. And
Yes.
anyway, that comes the name. They decided to give the name Igluscope as an homage to this man that would help them, that would make food, and that would engage also, sometimes engage into conversations, into animated conversations. Though I think those two things, the the need, the idea, the courage to start film production in Bahia, and with no means. But
Mm-hmm.
he had money. Roberto Pires had money.
Mm-hmm.
They brought lighting equipment, sound equipment. So if there is another, let's say, another interesting thing, more than interesting, another virtue of Redenção was the fact that, well, to answer your question, yes, it's possible to make film in Bahia. Second, we are beginning a small infrastructure that really helped from then on. Then you have from then on, William. I'm going to go into another topic, which I think is in
Please.
because it's a superimposition of things. You have that, and then you also have. Then comes Walter da Silveira,
Mm-hmm.
whom we really that impulse to bring cinema to Bahia doesn't come overnight.
Can you talk
It's
about who that is? Because I think people, he's a beyond Paulo Emilio, there aren't many um, Brazilian film critics or maybe cultural producers who people are familiar with, and indeed, none of his writing has been translated into English. So, for anyone listening that hasn't heard that name before or is unfamiliar with who that is, I'm wondering if you can maybe
yeah,
give a
because
brief
see,
overview.
let's go back. Yeah, you have the superimposition of those things that concur, that converge,
Yeah.
let's say, to cinema in Bahia. The Roberto Pires, Oscar Santana, those two profiles, Redenção, this idea of really experimenting and doing things, producing things. If you don't have the money to buy the originals, you find a way of creating something in terms of technology, whatever.
Hmm.
Um, the second thing I would say is the cultural moment of Bahia in the 50s, not only in terms of film, which goes to Walter da Silveira, but also it's a very interesting decade in Bahia for literature, for dance, for music, for theater, for literature, I have said already, for fine arts, for the visual arts,
The
and
theater.
the theater and film film goes into perhaps film is the last one of these other
Mhm.
arts because of technological things. But Walter da Silveira, I would say that Walter, together with, there are three names that I would bring at this moment to in the second half of the 50s, three names that also converge. One from Sao Paulo, which is Paulo Emílio Salles Gomes. Another one from Rio, which is Alex Vianney, second one, and Walter da Silveira. That you say triad, that
Trilogy, maybe.
no, triad of names.
Right.
That I think those were the ones responsible for the renovation of
Mm.
Brazilian cinema at that time. Each
Hmm.
one on, but what unites the three of them? Alex Vianney also combines film criticism, writing, and filmmaking. The
Right.
only one that had this profile of a filmmaker was Alex Vianney, who did Agulha no Palheiro, 1954. Repare, those are the filmmakers that are sounding the trumpets of what was coming for Brazilian cinema. Then with Nelson Pereira dos Santos, then you know the story.
Yeah.
But Walter is very important in the Bahia, in our culture, cinematographic culture, because he is in the 1950. He is the founder of a very prestigious, very important, very a seminal, I would say, uh, institute. Let's call it a
Mhm.
place that would gather filmmakers, cinephiles, interested people, critics, younger critics, which is the Clube de Cinema da Bahia, the Bahia Film Club, right? He is the founder of that club. So that brings again the importance of film clubs in Brazil, of this film culture. This needs to be, it's a research area that is asking for more research. From the beginning, from the Chaplin Club in Rio, the one that is connected with Limite, for example, you know that, the
Mhm.
Chaplin Club, to other initiatives. Sometimes they are connected with the founding of the archives of both the Cinemateca Brasileira and Cinemateca do MAM, of the
Right.
Museum of Modern Art in Rio. But they begin with these gatherings of, let's say, informal, not the museum, but informal meetings that would become the Cinemateca Brasileira. For example, Cinemateca Brasileira is from 1948. So there was in Rio and Sao Paulo, you had that thing before. But in Bahia, 1950, see, at the beginning of that very important decade, though film was perhaps the last one of those arts to really go into that wave of this new Brazilian, new Bahian wave, cultural wave, it's at the beginning of the decade with the founding of the cinema, the Clube de Cinema da Bahia. That Clube de Cinema had, among other, many other people, important people. You have there, for example, Rex Schindler, the producer. You had of course, Roberto Pires, Oscar Santana, they were all there. You have Orlando Senna, those are very key names of beginning. They were just young people, very
Mhm.
also. The energy of that is really amazing. You have to have that energy. And
Right.
then Glauber Rocha. Glauber is another one that comes that is strictly connected with Clube de Cinema da Bahia, right? So that's important. So Walter was a film critic. He wrote periodical, no, all
In the newspaper, things
constantly.
like that.
Yes, he wrote to newspaper to two big newspapers in Salvador, which is A Tarde, which is one, and also o Diário de Notícias,
Mm.
publishing his reviews, publishing his good text, excellent texts, at the same level of Paulo Emílio, was doing the same work that Paulo Emílio did later in O Estado de São Paulo and other publications. But Walter was also a film professor. So he really had, I mean, I think he's really the responsible for conveying this passionate, again, of feel of passionate link to cinema, uh, passionate vision, whatever. So he is really very important. He taught at the Escola de Teatro, film history, film
Mhm.
criticism, and he also taught at the Escola de Belas Artes of the also, let's say, created in the 50s, Universidade Federal da Bahia. Right.
Mm.
So it's a key name. We have to have, I mean, there is a book. I brought the book here because he wrote this. Do you mind if I keep talking like this, William?
Please, please.
Because I mean,
No, I don't mind at all.
hmm, it's a question that I have. I have this question that perhaps this question might be answered by an ex advisee of mine who wrote about cinema in Bahia, who is Cíntia Nogueira. I don't know if you have seen her or have been in touch. Cíntia
Oh
Nogueira.
yes, 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 yes.
She wrote about Walter da Silveira. She has this book called Walter da Silveira e o Cinema Moderno no Brasil.
Hmm.
It's a book published 2 years ago, right? But I didn't find this reference. But I have this collection here, uh, William, called Fronteiras do Cinema,
Right,
Walter da Silveira, right?
right.
Which is a collection of his writings published in 1966. And he has a text about, the text is called, just a moment. This is, a professor has always to do this, to
No
look at
rush. No rush.
references. It says, the text is, the title is Space and Time in CinemaScope.
Wow.
This is the name of the text. So it's a very interesting text. If we have time, I can talk about it later in
Okay.
connection with Redenção. But um, my question to Cynthia, which I didn't find in her book, is because this is a collection. It's a collection, very well done, but they don't give you the dates of when those texts are published. And I'm quite sure that he wrote that after The Robe. He mentions other films. He mentions other classic films of the widescreen at the middle of 1950s. But I'm quite sure that he wrote it before Redenção.
Hmm.
He doesn't mention Redenção, but perhaps the discussions, what he was talking, what was he was seeing on those films, very good films in CinemaScope. He mentioned. He talks about a few. Um, I think it's before Redenção, because there is a connect, and perhaps Cynthia. I'm going to write to her. I haven't been in touch with her for a long time.
She's working on an article for Cine to Meet You right now, actually.
She's
So
done good. So
so
yeah,
we're
I have
excited.
her contact. I have to ask her if she can locate to me the date
The date of the text.
of the
Yeah.
CinemaScope text by Walter da Silveira. But anyway, he writes at one point, William. He writes about something that has to do, doesn't have to do with the tenets again of what Fox planned for what CinemaScope could be. He
Mhm.
talks about a certain tension between the subjective and the objective, the interior and the exterior, also connecting with CinemaScope.
Hmm.
And when we look at Redenção, and we are talking about film noir, we are talking about a trauma, we are talking about something bad that one character has done, which is, what are their names? Which is the Braga Neto's character, not
Right.
Geraldo Del Rey, the one that had already a problem
Right.
with the law.
The criminal background.
The yeah, he had a criminal background, and he is the only one that receives like close up shots during the game when
Hmm.
that guy's reading the paper that talks about the psychopath, the guy that escaped the asylum, the killer. No,
Yes.
uh, he has he's thinking about he thinks about it. So it's interesting that the way that he cuts from close-ups to again widescreen shots, from uh, uh, this, let's say, this tension between interiority and interior and exterior. And he talks about that, and the why widescreen can create a special rhythm to a film when there is that tension. I don't know the words exactly, and I don't want to get them and read it to you because this can be boring. But anyway, I think, yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the text and to think about uh, the gambling table, for example.
Right.
When they're doing the gambling, That's when the guy gets the paper
Gets the
and
paper and reads.
leaves and reads the escape of this criminal. Um, you have that's an interior. It's an interior. They are downstairs. It's a kind of hideout, a kind of hidden thing because they are gambling. And then there is you have all. I think there are seven characters that, and he doesn't cut. Of course, why do you have to cut? Why do you have to? That goes with Bazin, André
Mm,
Bazin. Uh, 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 Praise of CinemaScope because CinemaScope made cinema be a way of cutting all the time, of editing, diminished the power of editing to create another idea of rhythm. And
hmm
that's the point because you have all the men, but then you have the cuts to when he's reading to Braga
Right.
Neto's character there, and that's one moment. But there are other moments as well. The
Of
gambling
course.
table, I think it's a good one, without cuts.
Right.
Um, and also, yeah, his Geraldo Del Rey's friend, that character, Raul is the name of the character.
His
Raul,
brother. His brother, I think.
his brother. Raul is always very serious, very
Yes.
concerned with the time because it's 8 something, 8 o'clock. They should be home.
Right. It should be home.
And, yeah, and we know that what's happening at home in their home. So he's always here. He's always how do you say, thinking inside. He's always I'm forgetting names here in English anyway.
Don't worry.
Um, so that's one thing that I think it's interesting. Also, William, the use of split screen. Again,
Sure.
you use the widescreen to divide and create tension to the spectator. You
Right.
have to have comparisons. You have to understand that those two images are there. You have to get something out of that juxtaposition of two images on the same. It can be memory, it can be a mental image, which is what the criminal is thinking when he is in his room and he's
He
thinking
has the
about the
dream.
woman, about Magnolia, when he has a dream, when Raul has a dream. See, he's all internal. That's what I was looking for. An internal, which is not very common. Again, CinemaScope was made to be shown the outside,
Right.
landscapes and sun and whatever landscape, to use the horizontality of landscape to take an advantage of composition, of framing. And he has, I mean, he does it very well because he changes it from. It's very interesting the way, for example, when he places the camera at the level of of the road, of the beaches, at the at ground level, so you can have the sky, and then in the sky you have the perspective of the roads going all the way to the foreground, to the background, I mean, with the coconut trees, for example. It's
Right.
very, it's really, I think
The opening scene. The
the
opening scene
opening,
when he
yeah,
goes
the
past the
opening,
criminal.
yeah, the opening when there is that, I mean, the opening again, there is in another way, there is that tension between interior and exterior. The
Mhm.
interior of the car with that huge window pointing to the man who is sitting at the left. So the composition is very well, I really like the film.
Yeah.
Although, again, the narrative is not that very much. I like the way that, I mean, this
Yeah.
inventiveness. I like the way that he did. I like the way of that consciousness of the widescreen, of the possibilities of the widescreen system outside
Sure.
of what 20th Century Fox designated to
For
this.
it to be for. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Also,
it's
it's interesting you brought up that it's an experimental film and thinking about why we should be interested in this film and for these experimental qualities that it brings to scope. But also, it's interesting to think about experimental cinema in general. We actually showed in New York City here. We showed Baccio before Redenção.
Pacho, right?
And Pacho is a film by Gabarosha, which was made with the extra film stock of Redenção,
Yes.
allegedly. And it's interesting to think of this period where experimental cinema in Brazil and in general was being kind of projected in these two different ways. I think Grabarosha is very clearly taking the page from European cinema, and then here we have Roberto Pires taking experimental aspects from American Hollywood cinema, and so there's that interesting contrast here of within Bahia even um, trying to project what experimental cinema should be or what audiences want to see even. And I think Grabarosha cares a little bit less about that, I think, evidently, in his film. But you do here see a interesting contrast. But beyond that, it's a clear reflection of what's being shown, I think. And I wanted to read this very brief thing that Gustavo Menezes wrote about Redenção. He wrote that it has the plot of a classic thriller, where an escaped serial killer, a murder mystery, a briefcase with undisclosed contents, suspense, all highlighted by chiaroscuro lighting. And experiments with camera and editing are also notable, Gustavo writes, in a clear attempt to emulate Hollywood language, especially in the passage of time. And you've talked about Walter da Silveira, and we've also talked about Hollywood cinema. But one thing I'm wondering about is, what do you think, in the case of Redenção, what do you think Roberto Pires is seeing, actually? Because you've mentioned all these interesting aspects, the internal monologues,
Yeah.
the interesting pans, and the tropes of noir, and it makes us have to wonder this question about exhibition in Bahia and exhibition in Brazil at that time period, because how do we pinpoint these techniques that he's using, and do they come from Nicholas Ray? Do they come from Fritz Lang? Do they come from Orson Welles, Jules Dassin, Billy Wilder, Sam Fuller?
Right.
And are these filmmakers being shown in Bahia at that time period? And then, does Roberto Pires have the opportunity to go to the American cinema and see that, and then walk a block and go to the Club de Cinema and see Eisenstein?
Right.
What exactly do you think he's able to see at that time period? Are these now canonical noirs being shown in Brazil? And also, we need to speak about B noirs, because Redenção very much fits into this category that we now call
B.
B noir in some
B
ways.
films. B film.
And
Right. Let me
and
write down here. Right.
in in Brazil at that time, in Bahia, do you think the films that are being shown are just the A noirs, or do we have, as we know, the Hollywood system taking over exhibition in Brazil? Do we even have, do you think, the lesser noirs, the more experimental ones? Because a lot of these things we're talking about, and a lot of the feel of Redenção, makes us think about a film like Detour, or not your run of the mill noir. So what do you think about an exhibition, and maybe what Pires is pulling off? Of course, Fritz Lang, the villains.
Right.
You can't
Right.
help but think about
Right.
that. But
Right.
are Lang's noirs being shown? Is it Sam Fuller? And do we even know? Do we have any idea? Are there any records of this theater in Bahia was showing,
Well,
these
William,
films?
yeah, this is something that I have done already, in the sense that once, this is a very good question that you have made, and very good idea, but needs more research. But one thing that strikes me always when I do research on film exhibition and film theaters, which is part of my more contemporary research, is that I like to look at newspapers as a prime source of information.
Right.
And at the time, in those major newspapers, they had sometimes one full page of ads, black and white ads, like in the US, like everywhere. Sometimes two full pages of newspapers like A Tarde or Diário de Notícias in Bahia, where you have, that's the content. Some, like when you, I have that page, but I have it somewhere. That's something that if I had time, I would show to you here. But you have this the announce the ad from Redenção, which is very in the newspaper, which
I love to see.
projects this idea of widescreen, talk igloscopes coming coming at something new. But what is being shown at the time of Redenção? When you look, when you open one of those newspapers, you have all those ads, right? And
Mhm.
when you do research on exhibition in Bahia, you'll see all those films. I mean, no, not all of them, but most of those noir films, B noir films, were shown in Bahia,
Mm.
popular circuit. It's funny that now when we look back, and those films became cult films now. When you talk about Detour, for example, and other films from that time. Um, Now they're cult films, but back then they were seen by huge crowds.
Mm.
I mean, people were familiar with those films, and
Yeah.
the thing that those two impulses, the experimental, the novelty, how to do a film in Bahia. You have Walter da Silveira, you have the meeting of cinephiles, you have you have the critics, you have the talks with Walter. But we also have, as you are saying, you also have people watching films, popular films, and what the public wanted to see. So I think there is a kind of balance in Redenção. It's a The film can respond to that convergence between experimental at the same time, that's in the film, and also something that would. It's not a long. It's about an hour film, which is almost like a B noir film. It is a B noir film. It's not a 2 hour movie,
Yeah.
not a 100-minute film. No, it's 1 hour, 1 hour and 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever. Uh, so you have that combination of the experiment. It's interesting. I think the convergence of the new, the novelty, the will to experiment with the novelty, the consciousness of making the first feature film in Bahia, but at the same time, how do you do it with, let's say, a simple narrative, something that people would relate to? The difference, what would the difference be? The landscape, the people, the scenes of the city, the bar that we mentioned already, the interiors of I mean, the interiors are in studio. It's something that were made. But anyway, I think that can respond to that. I think that is one way of thinking about that is really to make something popular, which was very popular. You know that story. The film. William, they had made, think about this, not only in terms of the film itself, but in terms of its release. Um, they made, I have pictures of that. They have made shop windows with clothes of the film, with photographs. You would pass on sidewalks. There is one big store in Salvador that was just like an American movie would
Wow.
do in place like New York, LA, whatever. They would do some like Grand Hotel with Greta Garbo. You would have be something, a memorabilia of the film there. So you had people wanted to see. This was this idea of the first film in Bahia was in the newspapers. People wanted to see, and people wanted to see the landscape, wanted to see themselves. Like we say, you want to recognize yourself on the screen. So that was the film broke. We know that it broke records of attendance at the Guarani Theater. You know that story as well.
Yes. Yes.
After one
It was.
week,
It was
it could be
successful. It did well.
double week, 3 times, 3 weeks, four. It could stay a month or even more in Bahia, because even in that very first week, there were people that were watching the film once, twice, 3 times. But then the film had to be taken out of
Mm.
circuit because of economic reasons, because the theater, o Guarani, which was a movie palace at the time, the only movie, the big movie palace in the center of, which was um, later became Cinema Glauber Rocha. It's still there at the place,
Yeah.
Itaú. It's in that square. Um, the film had to be taken out. And that was, I think, Roberto Pires says that. There is a 20-minute documentary on Roberto Pires
Directed by his
on,
son.
on YouTube,
Yes.
where you have, this is interesting, where you have a film clip from the premiere of Redenção, which was just somehow like a Hollywood premiere. Even that, so this aspect of showmanship, that's what we are talking about, was also given to a film like Redenção. So
Mm.
this idea of making really something, an event, a film event, they succeeded in doing
Hmm.
that, but just for a week, because then there were I had the name, that there was a film that took over on the Monday, because films would change Thursday and and Sundays in the past.
Mm.
So the film open on a Monday. It stayed a whole week until Sunday, and then on Monday it was changed for a Hollywood movie. Another.
Right. As
So
far as far as it succeeding, though, I find it interesting. Um, I mean, we're talking about what makes this work so unique within Brazilian cinema, and um, we often see the framework given about Redenção, that it is the film that began the ciclo de cinema Bahia, um, and also, therefore, you see a kind of direct connection to Cinema Novo from this film.
right,
But we find it so fascinating looking at it because we already brought up Walter da Silveira, and one of the things what he's most famous for is being someone who um, advocated for a kind of elevated style of European filmmaking, kind of montage, a kind of cinematography that was elite, that was Hiroshima Mon Amour, films of an elevated nature. And
yeah,
then you see the Ciclo de Cinema Bahia, and you don't see films like Roberto Pires' films. You see films that are social films by Bahia de Gilson Santos, Para Vento,
right,
um, numerous titles that don't fall under um, the category really in any easy way. So I kind of want to talk about frameworks a little bit because it seems to me that you can draw a connection, a more clear connection between Redenção and the cinema of José Valadão, for example, the Rio de Janeiro crime films,
right.
the audience pleasers, more so than you can with Cinema Novo, with the Ciclo de Cinema Bahia, and especially if we're going to say that Walter da Silveira is this kind of pioneer for um, influencing that generation with all of the movies that he was showing, Bicycle Thieves,
Right.
etc., then it seems strange. Redenção doesn't fit, and really neither does Roberto Pires in any way. His later works as well. So what exactly do you think about frameworks here? Because of course, Cinema Novo and that movement, which very much talks about taking influences from abroad and making them part of the Brazilian style of filmmaking, and we can say that Roberto Pires does that here. He
Right.
pulls from film noir and he makes a authentically Brazilian film here, I think. But it doesn't exactly fit. And how and do you think it's a useful thing for us to create this kind of historical narrative that we see Redenção and then we see Pátio, once again two very different films, 1959, Dia na Rampa, and a very different film, 1960. Bahia de Los Santos, a very different film.
Right.
Connecting those films, or kind of shaking up the pot there a little bit, and saying where does Redenção belong within the history of crime cinema in Brazil? Where does it belong within the history of films that take a lot from American cinema. And I find myself asking that when learning now a little bit more about Otto da Silveira and looking at the other films, it seems like a real odd man out from that period, from that movement, and the framework there seems strange. So what
Right.
exactly do you think about these kind of frameworks? Are they useful? Do they take away something? When we expect from Redenção to be a pioneering film, a kind of film that deals with the cliches of Brazilian cinema of the 60s, which might be the social themes in some ways, actually. And it doesn't do that. What do you think that does to people today? And how do you think maybe changing that framework can help us think about the film a little bit differently, or
Well,
move us away from maybe these boxes that's been put in?
Well, William, perhaps what you it's a methodological question, historiographical question. I think
Yes.
that you are bringing here,
Yes.
and we always fell into this categorization things. We always bring again the historiography. We always bring the ways of looking at Brazilian cinema. They're very strong, and what I think is that your generation and other generation, the younger generation is doing, like my students also, is to revise, to look back at the canon and
Hmm.
to rediscuss the canon.
Right.
And one way of rediscussing this canon is to first to look at films that were considered low films in
Right.
terms of culture. One
And
of
I
the
should
things,
and I should add to that.
and question again, and question
Yes.
this idea of high and low. Intent.
I
Do you
have a
know?
great quote. I have a great quote here. I want to quickly add, because Gabarosha says about Roberto Pires. He says of his films that they resent ideological depth. That Roberto Pires is still fascinated by the camera. He lives the myth of the frame and the cut. And I want to bring up that quote because it even accentuates this point of these people are existing on polar opposites, and of course they're friends, we know,
Right.
but there is that tension, I think, very much.
Yeah, but think about also about Patio. Think about Patio. Patio could never been done if there were not leftovers from Redenção.
Exactly.
You see
Yeah.
how one thing goes. It's another way of looking at things.
Right.
If you can do things, I mean, you have to be creative. And O Patio, the first time I saw it, right after Glauber Rocha's death, uh, I mean, this is a break. We organized 2 months after Glauber's death in August 1981. We organized at Cine Arte UF the first major retrospective of Glauber Rocha, which lasted for 3 weeks. It was called Ciclo de Estudos Glauber Rocha. It was more than a film series. We brought people to discuss at the Cine Arte UF at our University Film Theater, scholars, actors, technical crew, and we showed the greatest amount possible of films at that time. We showed in November of 1981. Then it was the first time I saw Patio. I had never seen it before, and it struck me as something constructivist, as something very avant-garde, with the design of the almost like the chess thing, the chess game of
Yes.
the Paris, uh, with Elena Inês
Hmm.
and the other guy whom I forgot his name.
Me too.
Um, yeah, and the editing. I mean, the whole concept was something completely different from. I heard about it. I had heard about it, but I had never seen it. We usually associate Glauber with Deus e o Diabo na Terra do Sol, Terra em Transe, then Barravento, then Antônio das Mortes, almost like this in this kind of categories. But Terra em Transe e Deus e o Diabo are, let's say, the uh, this generation, how do we look at Redenção again? Going back to is to find other ways. Try to find other ways of looking at those films.
Yeah.
And I'm responding myself, for example, which as I teach film language, or I'm very much connected with these aspects of, I mean, again, form and content, but how one thing builds the other one, how they can be sometimes at the same level, or how sometimes the form, the structure is better, much better than the narrative, which I think it's the case of Redenção. So we also try to get away from, I mean, the theme is important, but sometimes it's not that, I mean, it's always important, but sometimes we have to look at other ways, right? So what I think about Redenção, I mean, the difference between Redenção and then I mean, it's different. It's completely different from what came also before. When we look at Robato's short, the ones that I know, we see the landscape, we see the people because they are documentaries.
Yes.
And we see the people, and then that comes back even with Roberto Pires in A Grande Feira and Tocaia no Asfalto, where you see actor. I mean, this is the kind of, again, the power, the strength of new realism at that
Yeah.
time happening in Rio, in São Paulo, when we look at O Grande Momento, Roberto Santos, and other films. And of course, in Bahia. I mean, it's a kind of sensibility, which is also connect. I mean, it's not only Brazilian. We have to, I mean, we have, that's why I'm interested in, let's say, Japanese widescreen films from the late 50s, black and white, crime films. I'm interested in that. So when we put that film, Redenção, in the context of Brazilian cinema, and then later, you'll see there are many points of contact, many points that, I mean, I'm more interested recently, or maybe for a long time, more in convergences than in uh, differences, for example, right?
Right.
I don't know if I had answered the question or
No, I
I
think
don't.
I think you do answer the question, and yeah, there are absolutely movements that push away towards past frameworks and suggest new ones. Within this context, because I was talking with a friend before this, and it's hard to imagine what the scene was like, but it you have to imagine a scenario where Walter da Silveira is preaching something, and Roberto Pires is going the complete other way, and and that seems like it seems very interesting. For example, that you have a scholar and a programmer and exhibitor um, coming to coming to Bahia. He was from Bahia actually, showing Pudovkin, showing Marcel Carne, showing French poetic realism,
Right.
and I think his influence can clearly be seen much later on. But how it kicks off here, how this the Ciclo de Cinema Bahia kicks off here. Yeah, I just wanted to I guess make the point that I find it almost humorous in a way, almost a not a slight, but a like someone who's a student going against a teacher, perhaps. That it was
And
really American
yes.
cinema that would pioneer Bahian cinema, and the elements we've talked about, the experimental aspects we talked about. I don't know how you feel. Do you feel they really connect explicitly to American cinema, or do you see in this film aspects of Russian montage? Do you see elements of French poetic realism? Because
No, I think
for me,
no.
we see a noir completely. I think in
I
every way.
agree with you. I agree with you. I think it has much more connections with B noir, because of, even because of the, well, black and white, of course, film noir, but with B noir than with European cinema. Perhaps when we talk about that interiority of the dream sequences that could maybe come from something like Ingmar Bergman, maybe. I don't know if Walter da Silveira has written about Bergman. I don't know. But the films that Bergman started to do in the 50s.
Mhm.
But I don't see much of European cinema there. I see the car all the time, the car going and going, the importance, the key aspect of the car, of getting the body of the man on the beach. I mean, the scene, I mean, the whole lighting side. That is, I
Yeah.
think, that is
Can can
strictly some
can you
kind of
speak about
Benoit.
can you
And
speak
that
about
can be, maybe can be a kind of reaction towards uh, what Walter da Silveira would do. But I'm sure, William, that Walter da Silveira would also praise those American films. I
Hmm,
mean, when you talk about William Wyler, when we are talking about Wells, I mean, Citizen Kane was
yeah,
shown and discussed at that time. I mean, everybody knew about the possibility of really working within the industry, but with some, let's say, some auteur characteristics, some kind of control over the means you had. It was a, I mean, it was a film that wanted to be an industry,
yeah,
which never happened, this idea of an industry. It never happened. So there is, I mean, this tension that we are talking now exists even before the film that's done, you
sure,
know, because I mean, uh, it's what they were doing was something really independent. They had control. They had all kind of control on the film. So that's not the industrial way of doing like a film studio, but they had seen those films. They saw, they knew the power of creativity, of going against the grain,
right,
that you can find in the best film noir, or even not the best, even the bad film noirs, even the bad film noir, there is always something that's important. Remember, I mean, that's Godard that says that
right,
once you have a gun and a woman with a gun, that's a film. This kind of thing. When we see the steps of the man coming to the room, to like in Redenção, that's cinema. That's
right.
American. That's the kind of cinema. I mean,
Well, you brought up the cinematography, and I wanted to. I have like three more points that I guess I want to kind of bring up. And we haven't mentioned a couple names. We haven't mentioned Elio Silva, who does the lighting and cinematography,
yeah,
along with Oscar Santana,
right.
and of course Alexandre Natali, who's the composer of this film.
The music, right.
And yeah, I'm wondering if you can speak about. Well, here we have another Simanovo connection, maybe
Great cinema
multiple,
local connection. Right,
because Elio Silva, of course, is finishing doing Rio 40 Graus, 40 Graus,
right,
Rio 40 Degrees.
right.
I don't know what the
Mhm.
English is. Um, but he comes and he's hired to do this film. And then, of course, you have this composer who works with Umberto Maru,
Right.
works in the silent era, uh, coming and doing this B noir. So, can you maybe speak about that cinematographer and that composer? Who exactly are they, and why does it matter that they're working on this film? What should we take away from that? And of course, what do you think then about what they contribute to the film? What do you think about the score by Natali? What do you think about the cinematography here? And do you make a connection between
Well, this is
what's going on, or is this
right.
for them a break as well?
Well, first of all, going to context and going a little bit to history, to Brazilian film history. First of all, Hélio Silva, uh, who comes, I think he's from Minas Gerais, then he goes to Rio, and then he goes to Bahia. Uh, Hélio Silva had a very close link to Nelson Pereira dos Santos. This is important. Very close link. Uh, Hélio Silva was the second cinematographer assistant to the cinematographer of uh, Alex Vianney's Agulha no Palheiro, who is also considered to be at the beginning of Cinema Novo.
Mhm.
So that connection, we can think about that connection between the photographer and Nelson Pereira dos Santos, who at the time belonged to the Brazilian Communist Party. You know that.
Yes.
Nelson was connected with.
Right.
I think that
As was Alex Fiani. As
yeah,
was Alex Fiani.
yeah. So that the connection with Alex Vianney. See this. We mentioned Alex Vianney, Paulo Emílio, Walter da Silveira. Then we have Alex Vianney doing Agulha no Palheiro, which I think is 1954 or 55.
And then the next year he does Anna, which I don't know if you've seen his film
Yeah, I've
as
seen
well.
Anna. I've seen Anna. So that's before Redenção.
Right.
Think about what Hélio Silva was already building up, right? Conversations, talks, aesthetics,
Right.
what could be a Brazilian light, this connection, strong connection with neorealism, which we will see later in even A Grande Feira, of course, all the other films. And maybe when we think about Redenção, about the beaches, and especially the beaches and the coconut plantation, that's Brazilian, that's Bahia, that's natural, that's anyway, that's location, on location, that's not studio. But then Rio 40 Graus, that's before Redenção, right? Then, even before Redenção or close to Redenção, Hélio Silva is doing Nelson Pereira dos Santos, Rio North Zone in 1957. That's a strong connection. Also, the same year, Hélio Silva, who is a great cinematographer, is doing O Grande Momento, 1957,
Right.
São Paulo. When you make all these connections, I mean, it becomes clear. I mean, the reference, what he brings to Redenção and what he brings then to the other films is this connection, is this tradition already being praised, receiving prizes. So he does Tocaia. Then later, right, he does Mandacaru Vermelho, another contribution.
Another film shot in Bahia as well.
Shot in Bahia, 1961. What else? Well, A Grande Feira, that's 1961 also. Tocaia no Asfalto is another one. Matraga, A Hora e a Vez de Augusto Matraga, The Hour and the Time of Augusto Matraga, another major film. I like that film very much, from 1965. Then but that's 65. At the time, that discussion between 1956 and 1958, when Redenção was being done, I mean, he had already brought the experience. So we cannot make, that's obvious for me. That seems to be obvious. And Alexandre Ignatali also already has, he was new, he was young then, but Radamés Ignatali was the one that worked with Humberto Mauro. And so Alexandre is younger, but still he's working. The music connects with Hollywood cinema again. The suspense music at the times, the introspective interior music of the trauma, of the dream, of the mental images projected on the split screen. That's more, that's almost like a Hollywood again. It's in the tradition of the Hollywood soundtrack, of the great composers of Hollywood films anyway. So
what do you
think?
That
okay? Is that okay, William?
Very okay. Very okay.
Is that I'm looking at the time here.
I got one more question to ask, and I just to kind of conclude things. We're speaking a lot about Gustavo Menezes writes that Radames was the brother of Alexandre Natali, which is interesting to know. So I guess there's a connection there.
Right.
I want to conclude by just sort of a general connection question for you, and we're talking about Roberto Pires, who is a filmmaker that I think is still, underappreciated in some ways. A filmmaker whose works were only restored pretty recently. A filmmaker that I think we're still struggling with in some ways. There's still more to research and understand what he gave to Brazilian cinema. And I'm wondering, for you, how do you exactly perceive his legacy in Brazilian cinema? And when you think about this film in particular, Redenção, and that filmmaker, what are your big takeaways that someone who isn't familiar with his films, or someone curious about what this person means to the history of Brazilian cinema? What what would you say that would be? And
Well,
how do you personally feel about him, about his work,
right.
and about the need to continue to revisit it? And of course, knowing well that some of his films are lost, and that perhaps we won't really understand completely ever his complete contribution.
Right. Well, I think that, again, trying to get away from old perspectives, from traditional canons of that usually tend to divide filmmakers between authors, great directors, and artisans. I don't like that word. I mean, I understand the word and the concept, but that's a dated kind of concept, because it brings division, brings hierarchies. And we are at the time of revising hierarchies, sometimes even getting away from hierarchies.
Mhm.
And and I think that Roberto Pires, I mean, could be someone. It's not only either or. He can be and he can be. He is an artisan in that sense of the research, of the experimentation, of go into beyond limits. For example, that film, that science fiction film,
Obrigado Nuclear.
yeah, Brigada Nuclear. Also, the one that's almost like a new realist fiction film, that's Césio 147,
Mhm.
which is the only film that we have about the nuclear. That was a real nuclear tragedy in Brazil. When we think about that, uh, I mean, there is the artisan, of course. Always, for example, Abrigo Nuclear, he's experimenting with scenography, with settings, with clothing, with machines, with lighting. It's amazing what he does. When we look at, I like Abrigo. There are many people that don't like it, that laugh at Abrigo Nuclear. It's an interesting film. I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, of all things, think about this: cinema scope, a scope film, a science fiction film. As if we are not allowed to do. We cannot do. We will never do a science fiction. We will do. We can. We're going to do a science fiction. He did it, and very. I mean, there are things that are strange, but still, it's there. But I think it's a combination of an artisan and also a good film director, someone that has control over what he's doing. Perhaps because we are here, perhaps because we are not working within a strictly studio system, perhaps we are more independent than industrial. Perhaps there, I mean, at least we were, right? Um, and I think that difference, that distanciation between artisan, I mean, we should abandon that and trying to revive, be more generous. I would say, be more generous to our film history, be more generous to our filmmaking. Uh, and I'm going to finish this. It's a very good talk. I really liked our conversation. It
Me
was
too.
really, I'm happy
Me
to be
too.
here, and I'd like to thank
It's
you
been
all.
it's been amazing to have you.
Yeah, we have to do it again. We'll plan to do something later, but I'm just coming, William, just under the impact of the 17th edition of the Cine OP, which is the first and only film festival in Brazil that has a connection with film preservation.
Mhm.
It's divided the focus, the axis. There are three axes: education, history, and film preservation. And this year, I think the 17th edition was a kind of turning point because the main central focus of the festival, I came back from Ouro Preto 2 days ago. I
Mhm.
spent 6 days in Ouro Preto last week and the beginning of this week. The main focus was on indigenous media. So this film festival planned has has been planned for months, and it happened at the same time that we had that tragedy 3 weeks ago, three and a
Right.
half weeks ago,
The
where you have
journalists.
Don Phillips, yeah, the journalist and the indigenist that were killed by assassins, I mean, in the forest, in the Amazon. So we were all very mobilized. And the idea that we had an indigenous centered focus, curatorial focus for this festival also brought other, let's say, invisibilizar, invisibilizados, people that are not, I mean, groups, communities, collectives, uh, initiatives for new museums, for new archives, for example, that never received a place on a festival like this.
Mhm.
Because there has always been, um, from a neurocentric, white, middle class, or upper class concepts of museums, archives, the films, the preservation given to uh, inheritors of their parents' filmic legacy. And now this year, with this focus on the indigenous media, I mean, it was amazing. We had all different, I mean, very different from all parts of Brazil. And then that's something I have the catalog is here because I'm reading. It's a huge catalog. Look at
Wow.
that.
Yeah.
It has almost like 500. I mean, it has almost 400 pages,
It's
which is
incredible.
an amazing catalog, Cineope. And I was in one. I mean, I was in all seminars devoted to film preservation. I was there, and there was. This brings us to Roberto Pires again. That's why I wanted to finish this. I was really surprised. I mean, no. Before I say this, we always go to these film festivals to talk, to give lectures from a place of authority.
Yeah.
We professors, we are the ones that know the truth. I'm making a joke, but I mean, in one way, it's this. But this time, when I read the whole day by day programming of the Cineope, I knew that I was going there not to talk, but to listen to people, to listen to what were, and it was real. I mean, we can talk about, I could talk about another half hour on this, but I wanted just to finish with this. Um, it was last Monday, this Monday, from 10:30 to 12:30 in the morning. We had a seminar that talked. Look, the title of the theme was "Technologies and Democratization: Independent Initiatives of Audiovisual Preservation." And then, William, comes this project from Sergipe, from the Northeast, from Sergipe, which is called Cinemáquina. You can type
Yeah.
Cinemáquina, you will find it. It's one word, Cinemáquina, where this very, very interesting young researcher, she's probably in her mid 20s or something, Moema Pasqualini, she introduced a new scanner for digitalization of 16 millimeter, Super 8, and 8 millimeter gauge.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, how do you say this? Low, the small gauge films,
Yeah.
which was totally designed and built in Sergipe. And which, I mean, if we buy a Film Fabrique, which we have at UFI for the same thing from Holland,
Hmm.
it would cost us 200,000
Yes.
reais. And this one was made with 20,000 reais. and it was made in Sergipe. It was so, see, I'm just finishing this because this reminds me again, brings us to part of the talk we had here that
Brings you back to
Roberto,
Roberto
I mean,
Pires,
Roberto Pires, yes,
making
we're
a
talking about
lens.
Bahia, we are talking about the Northeast. Now I'm talking about Sergipe. So it's really and then I mean there is this will, there is this power, there is this energy to build, to do things. And we are going to do things. They are going to do things, right? Because they are doing already. So
Amazing.
it's amazing. It's really something. If you look at Cinemachina, you'll have there the whole how it was built, how it was made, what's doing. You'll have samples of already films that had been digitized in this scanner. So this is amazing. This is really something that makes me very happy, and something that I would say it's going to be very difficult to plan the next Cineop unless it goes within the same curatorial aspect, the same curatorial energy, I would say, because we came to a point where we say, I would say in Portuguese, there is no return. Não tem volta. Não
Right.
tem volta. It's from here to the future, here to the, and I only hope, I'm crossing all my fingers to really hope that we have a change in October of the that would really make this, let's say, all these already done dreams, all these dreams to a new Brazil where we can really put this uh, regressive winds, very bad winds that we are suffering from the last few years out, I would say, in the garbage can of history, if that makes sense
It
in English.
does.
Na lata de lixo da história, in the garbage can of history. So,
I think it's a beautiful note to end on. I want to thank you again, Joao, for coming here, for shedding so much insight onto this film that we both agree really deserves it. The conversation has been really illuminating. I feel like I've taken a lot of new things about the whole scene of cinema in the state of Bahia, and also what Roberto Pires' pioneer and contribution truly was. So it's been really, really special to have you. I want to thank you once again. It's so special to have everyone else who's tuning in. Thank you for coming. The conversation will remain online forever, so people can revisit it continually to get new ideas about this film. And I look forward to having a continued dialogue with you about this, maybe again in the future, about
we'll do it.
different
We'll do
things.
Yeah.
And everything you brought up to conclude, I totally co-sign. And that film scanner very much clearly contains the spirit of what Roberto Pires was trying to do. And initiatives like that are so essential right now in Brazil. And we can both hope that more of them are to come.
Okay, William. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank
I'm
you,
really
everyone.
happy to have this conversation with you, and I hope we can do it not remotely, but sometime presently.
Okay. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone who's tuning in.
Bye bye.